Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another deep dive. We take complex topics and really try to distill them into the insights you need to be well informed. Today, we're unpacking a series of, escalating developments in the Middle East. We're focusing on two key regional powers and their allies. Our mission really is to cut through the noise, examine the recent events, sort of like independent news reporters, and understand the bigger implications of this pretty volatile situation.
Absolutely. We'll be looking at what's transpired, over the past year or so, how the various players have responded, and what this current landscape really suggests about the future of regional stability. We want to help you connect the dots, see the bigger picture behind the headlines, offering a clear, impartial view.
Okay, so the Middle East, always complex, but April 2024 really felt like a new, intense chapter opened up between Iran and Israel. What exactly set off this specific rapid escalation?
Yeah, it's fascinating how quickly things intensified. It really went from what seemed like maybe an isolated incident to this huge aerial assault that kicked off the
Right.
April 13th. There was this pretty dramatic maritime incident in the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, the ship seizure.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Iranian commandos used a helicopter, boarded the MSC Ares, that's the Portuguese-registered container ship in international waters, right off the UAE coast. Now, this ship was leased to Mediterranean Shipping Company by an affiliate with an Israeli principal. That's key.
Okay.
Iran directed the vessel to its territory, claiming he was violating maritime law. But this immediately prompted calls from Israel for international sanctions against Iran. They called it piracy.
So that maritime incident was the spark. What came next? How did it escalate further on the ground?
Well, within hours, really, still April 13th, going into the 14th, we saw a multi-pronged attack start. First, Hezbollah, the major group operating out of Lebanon, attacked northern Israel. About 40 rockets, roughly. And that prompted a swift Israeli retaliation. They bombed a Hezbollah weapons manufacturing site in Lebanon. So right away, you see that tit-for-tat starting.
And that set the stage for the much bigger coordinated action directly from Iran itself.
Precisely. Later that same day, Iran and its aligned groups launched a truly substantial attack on Israel. We're talking about something like 300 drones plus multiple ballistic missiles. And it wasn't just Iran acting alone.
Right, the proxies were involved too.
Exactly. You had the Houthis in Yemen, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, groups like the Badr Organization, the True Promise Corps. Allied factions from Yemen, Iraq, Syria all participated. A very wide-ranging operation.
300 drones and missiles. That's a huge number. What was the international response? I mean, how did other countries react in real time to that barrage?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. We saw this critical, almost surprising alignment of forces. Over 100 of those drones, and missiles too, were intercepted, not just by Israel. Forces from the United States, the UK, and Jordan played a major role.
Jordan too. That's significant.
Very significant. French naval and air forces were also involved. There were even reports, of Syrian air defenses engaging Israeli interceptors, trying to shoot down the incoming threats. It really showed this multinational defense effort, kind of an aerial iron dome formed over Israel involving Western and, crucially, regional partners.
So a huge defensive effort. What was the actual impact on the ground in Israel from all those projectiles that did get through or maybe didn't?
Well, despite the scale, the actual physical damage was relatively minor. A key airbase, Nevatim, got some light damage, but it stayed operational, which says a lot about the defense systems.
Okay.
Tragically, though, a 7-year-old child was critically injured by shrapnel, and about 31 other civilians had minor injuries, mostly from anxiety or, running for shelter.
So limited physical damage, thankfully, but the psychological impact must have been immense. What did this mean for Israel's next steps? How did they decide how to retaliate?
Right. So after these strikes, there was intense debate inside Israel's war cabinet. How do we respond? And there was huge international pressure. Lots of calls for de-escalation, trying to prevent a full-blown regional war. There were even reports, unconfirmed, but reported that the U.S. might greenlight Israel's planned ground offensive in Rafah, down in Gaza, if Israel agreed not to hit back directly at Iran.
Interesting trade-off, potentially.
A very complex calculation. Plus, both the U.S. and Europe moved pretty quickly to tighten sanctions on Iran. So diplomatic and economic pressure, too.
But Israel did respond directly. What happened on April 19th?
They did. On the morning of April 19th, Israel retaliated. They struck 3 locations in or near Isfahan International Airport in Iran. The targets included a military base and, significantly, a radar system linked to the Natanz nuclear site.
Hitting near a nuclear site. That sends a message.
A very clear message. Iran initially claimed its air defenses shot everything down, But satellite imagery later showed damage to an air defense battery and that radar system.
And Israel, did they claim it?
No. Israel maintained strategic ambiguity. Didn't comment, didn't claim responsibility. There were also reports of hits on Syrian army bases in southern Syria, some explosions in Iraq, even missile debris found in central Iraq, suggesting maybe a launch point from there. It got messy regionally.
And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. We saw major military moves by global powers, especially the U.S., around this time.
No.
What did those deployments look like?
That's right. The U.S. made some very significant deployments,
Mm.
clearly signaling support for Israel, but also deterrence towards Iran. They sent an extra squadron of F-22 fighters. Those are top-tier stealth jets.
Right.
Plus 4,000 Marines, a full Carrier Strike Group 9, with 12 ships into the Persian Gulf. That's serious power projection.
And in the Med?
In the Eastern Mediterranean, you had 3 Wasp-class amphibious assault ships, 2 destroyers, the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit, and then another Carrier Strike Group, the USS Abraham Lincoln Group, was moved over from the Pacific. It was about positioning overwhelming force, really. Deterrence and readiness.
Okay, so stepping back from the immediate tit-for-tat,
Hmm?
what are the deeper strategic goals driving these players? Iran, Israel, groups like Hezbollah. What's the bigger picture here?
Right, connecting the dots. These events aren't just random flare-ups. They fit into longer-term objectives. Take Hezbollah. It's a major force in Lebanon, heavily backed by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps funding, training, the works. Hezbollah explicitly defines itself in opposition to Israel. Their stated goals: drive Israel out of Lebanon, and ultimately they advocate for Israel's elimination.
And Iran's role in that?
Iran supports this whole axis of resistance. That includes groups not just in Lebanon, but Iraq, the Palestinian territories, Syria, Yemen. The overarching goal for Iran's Islamic regime is to push out Western influence, push out rival influences like Israel's, and reshape the region. They view Israel as an illegal state.
And Israel's perspective on Iran?
From Israel's viewpoint, Iran's nuclear program is an existential threat.
Yeah.
They haven't ruled out military action against Iranian nuclear facilities. They see it as vital to their security, so the core conflict is deep.
And we saw this play out with escalating violence, especially on the Lebanese border well beyond April. Can you describe that trend?
Yeah, the trend was pretty stark. After October 2023, attacks were averaging maybe 160 a week across that border. By mid-September 2024, that jumped to over 300 in 1 week. Then end of September 2024, over 700 strikes in a single week, mostly driven by Israel hitting targets in Lebanon.
Wow, a huge increase.
A massive increase. And we also saw Israeli warplanes doing these threatening overflights, breaking the sound barrier over Lebanese cities. That was quite rare before mid-2024. It felt like a deliberate escalation in pressure.
This constant escalation, it naturally makes you ask, what are the plausible scenarios for things getting even worse? Where could this head next?
Analysts are definitely looking at several concerning possibilities. Scenario 1. A major Israeli ground offensive into southern Lebanon. The goal would be to push Hezbollah forces back from the border, create a buffer zone like they had years ago. But that needs a lot of troops, maybe 30,000, huge commitment.
Right. What else?
Scenario 2. A coercive air campaign by Israel. Target Hezbollah's infrastructure, its leadership, try to weaken them enough to force a ceasefire, maybe create leadership turnover. Then there's a third scenario. A major counter-escalation by Hezbollah. They try to inflict steady pain on Israel, maybe through sustained rocket fire or bigger attacks, create that sense of an unwinnable war for Israelis.
All of those sound incredibly risky. What are the biggest dangers for each side if any of these scenarios actually happen?
All the risks are profound. For Israel, launching a ground offensive means potentially heavy casualties, equipment losses, and Hezbollah has proven resilient before. For Hezbollah, they face massive damage to infrastructure, significant casualties. They could also risk alienating their own support base in Lebanon if the destruction gets too bad.
What would they stop?
History suggests Hezbollah is willing to absorb huge costs, even losing senior leaders, without giving up. And their backer, Iran, would likely just resupply them eventually, dragging things out. Plus, air power alone might struggle against fighters dug in, hidden underground, or among civilians. Hezbollah's shorter-range rockets are also harder to stop completely with air defenses. It's a tough problem.
So, faced with this complex, dangerous situation, what have global powers, especially the U.S., tried to do to manage it?
Well, the U.S. has really pursued a dual approach. Diplomacy on one hand, military pressure on the other. Diplomatically, U.S. officials have pushed plans, like relocating Hezbollah forces north of the Blue Line, that's the UN border, and getting Israel to stop its overflights, maybe bring in more international observers like UNIFIL or possibly German troops.
Does that work?
The sticking point is Hezbollah says they won't stop attacks as long as the conflict in Gaza continues. It's all linked.
On the other hand, the military pressure.
The U.S. continues to provide significant military aid to Israel: equipment, ammo, air defense, intelligence. The idea is to increase pressure on Hezbollah and on that way. Some experts also float ideas about informal deals, maybe both sides just quietly agree to curb cross-border fire, let civilians return home, with some agreements about Hezbollah's presence near the border.
Okay, so that brings us to more recently, June 2025. You mentioned earlier this felt like a significant shift. What happened then that was so different?
You're right, mid-June 2025 was a major turning point. Israel directly attacked Iran's nuclear program and military assets. This wasn't like the limited April retaliation. This was overt, deep strikes targeting highly sensitive sites inside Iran. A clear escalation.
And there were reports of high-level figures killed.
Yes, critically. Reports indicated Hossein Salami, the top commander of the IRGC, and Amir Ali Hajizadeh, head of its aerospace force, were killed. Iran's supreme leader appointed replacements immediately, but just underscores how significant those losses were.
And Iran's reaction?
Their foreign minister flat out called the strikes a declaration of war. That language itself shows how fundamentally the situation shifted.
With that level of attack, what were the reported impacts? Casualties, damage?
It was grim, unfortunately. Tragic reports on both sides from the strikes and the retaliations that followed. In Israel, one barrage killed 3 Israelis, wounded dozens, including a baby. Other attacks reportedly killed 8, injured nearly 300 in central areas, 5 killed, 23 wounded up north. Another incident, 7 dead, 200 injured, 35 missing.
And in Iran?
Iran's health ministry reported 128 killed in their territory over just 2 days following the Israeli strikes. So a really heavy human cost to this escalation.
Let's shift gears slightly to the economy. The Middle East is so crucial for energy. How might this situation affect global markets, particularly oil?
Yeah, it's always a major concern, that link between Middle East tension and economic stability, especially oil. You got the Strait of Hormuz, nearly 30% of global seaborne oil goes through there. Any major disruption is a huge shock.
But how likely is a full disruption?
Well, here's the thing. While initial price spikes happen when tensions flare up, markets often price in a new normal relatively quickly. Iran itself relies heavily on the strait for its own oil exports. So while they could disrupt it, it's unlikely they'd completely shut it down because it hurts them too. Kind of a self-limiting factor.
Like we saw with Russia-Ukraine initially.
Exactly. Markets eventually stabilized after the initial shock. So unless the conflict escalates to the point of sustained, widespread disruption of shipping, the broader market impact might normalize, even if headlines stay scary.
Okay, another angle here is the less visible conflict, the cyber domain. How is that playing out?
Right, this conflict definitely has a fierce cyber dimension. It's a key covert front. Both sides are actively engaged in cyber attacks. They target critical infrastructure, military systems, information networks. We've seen reports going back years like the Stuxnet virus hitting Iran's nuclear facilities, widely believed to be a joint U.S.-Israel effort.
And Iran hitting back.
Yes. Reports suggest Iran has retaliated with cyber attacks on things like Israeli hydroelectric plants, water facilities, and beyond direct attacks, there's rampant information warfare. Fake news, disinformation, propaganda trying to sway public opinion, sow division, both domestically and internationally.
How effective is that?
It's covert, it's relatively cheap compared to missiles, but the damage can be really severe, eroding trust, impacting security, influencing how people see the conflict.
Which brings us to how different commentators are framing all this, especially regarding, say, U.S. involvement. What are some of the takes out there?
Well, you hear some strong, often opposing views. One prominent commentator, for instance, has been very vocal, warning that Israel is pushing towards war with Iran and urging the U.S. very strongly not to get drawn in, saying things like, U.S. troops shouldn't die for another country's fight. This commentator also questions U.S. taxpayer money, funding certain actions, and raises concerns about the influence of lobbying groups representing foreign interests, arguing it can stifle alternative viewpoints.
Okay, and what about the official stance, the U.S. administration? Has there been any shift noticeable there?
It's nuanced. Some analysts point to the current U.S. cabinet being perhaps less hawkish than in a previous term, maybe leaning more towards diplomatic options. But others argue that ultimately the president's personal calls with leaders in the region might carry more weight than the cabinet's collective view.
Is the U.S. seen as impartial?
Well, there's a debate. Should the U.S. be an impartial observer? Or are its interests inherently tied to, say, weakening Iran, given Iran's long history of actions against U.S. interests and personnel? Some analysis suggests that letting Israel conduct attacks on Iran might even serve broader U.S. competitive interests. Since Iran is allied with Russia and increasingly China, weakening Iran could potentially hurt those rivals.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Very. Before the June 2025 strike, the U.S. did evacuate non-essential personnel from several Gulf countries, showing they anticipated potential blowback. Washington's juggling act is immense. Try to stop Iran getting nukes, but keep the U.S. out of another Middle East war.
This deep dive really underscores just how interconnected everything is in the Middle East. Maritime incidents, missile strikes, troop deployments, cyber battles. It's all linked and evolving incredibly fast.
It really is. And it's such a powerful reminder that beneath those daily headlines, you've got these deep layers, historical grievances, strategic aims, complex dependencies between all the players. Understanding those nuances is just crucial if you want to grasp where the region might be headed. These aren't isolated events. They're part of a much bigger story unfolding.
We've covered a huge amount today, from those intense clashes in April 2024 and the major escalation in June 2025 to the diplomatic maneuvering and that unseen cyber conflict.
And as you, listening, reflect on all this information, maybe consider this. We live in an era where information itself is truly a battlefield. How does this pervasive information warfare, the disinformation, the cyber threats to infrastructure, the competing narratives constantly pushed out, how does that impact our collective understanding of these critical global events? And what new responsibilities does that place on all of us as individuals just trying to stay truly well-informed? In a world where discerning fact from fiction seems harder than ever,